Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar presentation, the California Voters' Choice Act, Research and Lessons Learned. We're excited to have you all join us today. It's a big group, about 100 folks registered for today's event. And so I just wanted to go through some quick housekeeping before we get started. There is a chat window in your bottom, towards the bottom of your screen. And so we're going to use that to answer questions, and so feel free to test that feature out now if you would like. And I'm going to give it just another minute before we get started. So as we get started, I wanted to go ahead and get to know who is on the call. And so I am launching a quick poll. Let us know where you're calling from, what organization you're with, what type of work you do, and if you plan to do voter education in 2020. Feel free to respond to the short poll in front of you as we wait for our colleagues to join us in the next few minutes. Great, and it looks like people are calling from Northern California and Southern California. We have some folks from the Central Valley, and we have a lot of nonprofit organizations on the call. And over 90% of you plan to do voter education in 2020, and about half of you engaged in 2018. So thanks for sharing that information with us. So let's go ahead and jump into our presentation. So welcome again. My name is Astrid Ochoa. I'm the Executive Director of Future of California Elections. Future of California Elections was founded in late 2011 to modernize elections and expand participation. And our model is to bring together nonpartisan nonprofit organizations to work alongside with election officials to advance our democracy. And in 2017, Future of California Elections launched our Voters' Choice California project, which I'll share more about. And we worked very closely with the California Civic Engagement Project. And so we're joined today by Dr. Romero, the founder of the California Civic Engagement Project.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome. Thanks, Mindy, for joining us.
Thanks for having me and making this time together for us to present this important conversation.
Great. And do you want to tell us a little bit about CCEP?
Sure. So we are a nonpartisan research center here at the USC Price School of Public Policy. We're actually headquartered in their building up in Sacramento. And if folks might be familiar with our work over time, we previously were at UC Davis, and about a year and a half ago we moved to USC. But again, we're physically in Sacramento, and we do research as your slide shows, on civic engagement and voting issues. And really, hopefully, the reason to do the work is to inform on the ground efforts aimed at improving not only participation rates, but also very much so levels of representation in California. And to do that, we partner a lot with nonprofit groups and community groups to make sure that we can be of help in disseminating our research to them, but also to learn from them in the types of research questions that we think are important, or that they tell us are also important for them in their work.
Great, thank you. So I just want to go over our agenda quickly for today. Next slide, thanks. Great, so we're going to look at what the Voters' Choice Act is and what happened in 2018 implementation. And as I mentioned, our project, Voters' Choice California, was very active. And so I'll share a little bit about our work, and then we're going to jump into the bulk of the presentation, which is really the work of Dr. Amaro around what the research says about voter education and outreach. And then we will look at where we are today in VC implementation for the 2020 election and talk about a couple of brief next steps. So that is our journey this afternoon. Anything else you wanted to add, Mindy, before we jump in?
No, except for, yes, please call me Mindy. Perfect. and everyone on the call, please call me Mindy.
Great. So the Voters' Choice Act is an optional voting model that became law in 2016. I wanted to emphasize that because just know that if you are in a county that is transitioning to the Voters' Choice Act, you're only one of 15 in 2020. So not everyone in the state will be voting under this new election model. The goal of the Voters' Choice Act was to make voting easier and more convenient and accessible for voters. And in 2018 was the first time that a county could adopt this new model. And so 5 counties went forth and kind of kicked the tires of this new model. And so we have a couple of lessons that we've learned. In 2020, we have 15 counties, and these 15 counties together represent over % of the California electorate. And you can see here on this slide, the counties that are going forward. The boxes, the yellow boxes highlight the counties that did it in 2018, and we'll be continuing with the model in 2020. But we have Los Angeles County, which is the biggest jurisdiction in the nation, and Orange County in Southern California, and then several counties in Central and Northern California. So really exciting to see these changes happening. So how does the Voters' Choice Act change voting? Well, again, the goal is to give voters flexibility, to give them more options. And we've been elevating the hashtag more days, more ways to emphasize that in social media. So you may have seen that. And the first thing that is going to be different for voters is that they will receive a ballot in the mail, even if they did not request one. This will not happen in LA County. So I just want to emphasize that. For all counties that transition to the Voters' Choice Act model, except in Los Angeles County, voters are going to get a ballot in the mail, even if they don't request one. So that's going to be an important part of educating voters that they are in fact going to receive a live ballot in the mail. Additionally, voters have an extended early voting period. They'll be able to vote for 11 days leading right up to Election Day, and they will be able to return their ballot by mail or at a ballot drop box, and they won't need postage to return at either of these locations, or they can visit any vote center in the county. So precinct-based voting is no longer going to be followed in counties. You can vote by your place of work, by where your kids go to school, by where you go to the gym, etc. Wherever it is convenient for you, you can go and vote there. And that's true for all the counties participating in the Voters' Choice Act. Additionally, when voters choose to visit a vote center, they have expanded services. So you can register to vote on the same day, also known as same-day registration. You can replace your ballot. You can get language assistance. You can get access to accessible voting equipment. And so that'll be really valuable for many voters to get assistance, to get their questions answered. Additionally, voters with disabilities now have access to remote accessible vote by mail in BCA counties and actually across the state starting in 2020. That means that a voter with a disability can access their ballot at home and vote at home and work with their election office to return their ballot in a secure envelope. And additionally, thanks to the Voters' Choice Act, every county has to have a language accessibility advisory committee and a voting accessibility advisory committee. These are committees that advise the election office on how to best serve voters with limited English proficiency and voters with disabilities. So these are some of the changes that you will see happening. So the Voters' Choice California project is a project of Future of California Election, and we wanted to support counties and communities transitioning to the Voters' Choice Act. So we launched this in 2017, and our goal was to make sure that elections were accessible for all, that there was robust public engagement, that was diverse and effective, that all voters understood how and when to cast a ballot, and that we saw voter participation increase and minimal disenfranchisement. And so we have a great team of partners from civil rights organizations, civic engagement, working in partnership with our counties. And so the logos you see here are our steering committee. These folks were engaged deeply in 2018, 2017 to really support communities' transition to the Voters' Choice Act. And so here are some of the things that we did. We, let me advance the slide. There we go. We supported local hubs or local coalitions in the 5 Voters' Choice Act counties. We worked very closely with the Office of the California Secretary of State. In fact, one of the kind of key achievements in working with the Secretary of State was the translation glossaries. So as you can imagine, a new voting model introduces new election terms, or I should say terms in elections that are not used daily. And so how you translate is going to be important, and having that consistency in translation will help make sure that voters are getting accurate, plain language information. And so we worked on glossaries for covered languages to make sure that this was a resource available for county election officials and nonprofits doing voter education work in other languages. We hosted statewide coalition calls on a monthly basis to elevate best practice, and some of the practices that came out there was, again, using that hashtag more days, more ways. One of our partners came up with it, and we helped to elevate that to kind of tie the conversation together and making sure that people knew that this was happening. The VEOAC is the Voter Education and Outreach Advisory Committee. This was a model that we saw in San Mateo County, and it really elevated the role that partnerships can play in working with the election official to enhance and expand reach of voter education efforts. We administered a $300,000 grants program to support these local partnerships. We advised on local strategies, developed plain language materials and toolkits, all of which is available on our website, voterschoice.org. And we hosted convenings, and those are the photos that you see here as one of our convenings in San Mateo County. And we did another convening with the California Secretary of State's VCA task force in Sacramento. And the goal of all of this was to learn together and to really assess what was happening and how do we make this first election cycle the best possible by elevating those best practices. So going into the next slide, before we continue the agenda, here are some of the things that we learned from our experience in managing this project, and we'll see much more in depth from Mindy on some of these. But from our experience in our Voters' Choice California project, what we learned about implementation was that collaboration and partnerships are key. Voters' Choice Act implementation is bigger than any one government office or one nonprofit can take on alone. We learned that sharing knowledge and leveraging existing resources helps expand the reach of that voter education. We learned the importance of recognizing who your audience is and giving voters what they need. And we have a vote plan document that helps talk about how do you speak to voters, and that's a resource available on our website. We learned that voter education takes resources and expertise. So resources, I'm talking dollars. You will spend more time speaking with voters, doing outreach for Voters Choice Act than you will for standard GOTV, because you want to explain what the changes are, or where their closest vote center is, or what a vote center is. And so on average, folks were spending maybe 2 to 5 minutes extra with each voter. And so that's something to take account as you do your planning for voter education and budgeting staff time, et cetera, is understanding that voter education under the VCA will take more resources while voters learn this new voting model. Additionally, voter education takes expertise when you're reaching out to specific communities. And so reaching out with culturally sensitive messaging and materials was really, really valuable to how voters responded to the information. Finally, we learned that we need to continually evaluate about what is working and what is not working. And with that, I think it's a good transition to Mindy's presentation about what the research is showing. So Mindy, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Okay, so I'll go ahead and jump on in. Let's see if I can work the controls. Have I been given access to the controls already?
Yes, you have.
I have, okay. I'm not seeing them right now, so that's why. Oh, well, it's letting me do it in a different way. Okay, that'll work. Perfect. Okay, everyone. So I'm going to cover our research around outreach and education in the VCA, but I'm going to first just talk a little bit about the study that this work came from. So we were asked by the James Irvine Foundation. We've done a lot of research around vote centers and vote by mail primarily, and then the possibility of vote centers in California. And in 2017, the James Irvine Foundation asked us to consider research on those 5 counties that Astrid already outlined that were the early adopters. What can we learn along a whole host of research questions that really the purpose of the research would be to inform ongoing implementation, both in those counties as they continue with the VCA, but also for counties that were considering adoption. And you can see our website there. All of the research materials are available publicly. If you can't find it for some reason, of course, please contact me directly. And I will say, beyond today's presentation, if there's any questions on what I've talked about today or any of the other research, happy to continue a conversation. You can reach me via email, by phone, whatever makes sense. Happy to make sure that folks are aware of the work and it's clear. Okay. See if the PowerPoint's going to work for me. Oh, there we go. Now the controls are viewable. Okay, awesome. To tell you a little bit more about the study itself, we were very fortunate to have just a really fantastic advisory committee that gave us input from the very beginning of the study as we were formulating those research questions, made up of, as you can see, election officials like Sacramento County Registrar of Voters, Courtney Bailey, Joe Holland, Jim Azari, other election officials, Dean Logan, but also made up of advocates and those working in the field. So of course, Astrid was one of our really valued members of the studies advisory committee. I'll go ahead and move, let's see. There we go, it's working great. The methodology itself was multi-method. So it's 40 confidential in-depth interviews with election officials from adopting counties, election officials from across the state that in some capacity had a leadership role in the implementation of the VCA. Also, of course, included were statewide voter advocacy groups, community groups, and just other stakeholders that were involved in the implementation process in, of course, 2018 itself. We also did 6 focus groups in those 5 counties, adopting counties. Our colleagues over at the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside did a social media analysis, which is actually in the brief that I'm covering today, our outreach brief. And did a survey as well. And then of course, we also did an analysis of the public materials. And I'm just trying to get there we go. I'm trying to get the controls to work for me, sorry about that. The briefs itself, so if you go on our website, we actually have a page for this study. And we have released 4 briefs covering 5 topics. So first was key considerations of implementation. If a county is considering adopting, based on the experiences of counties in 2018, what should they be thinking about? Another one on the collaboration process itself, another on both the EAP and the vote center siting process, what all entails with that, and then one specifically on outreach and education, and that's what I'm going to cover today. Okay, the two research questions are: one, what factors contribute to successful voter outreach efforts? And two, what are the key challenges, of course? We know there are challenges to conducting outreach under the VCA, and Astrid already covered some of that already, so we'll elaborate some. So on that first research question, so there are four main components under this as we broke out our analysis. So one, outreach, and I'll get into details here in a moment. The outreach collaboration with stakeholders, coalition building and recruitment. Next, targeted outreach materials, and then effective messaging. And before I actually jump into the work, I do want to just emphasize again the absolute critical importance of outreach in the Voters' Choice Act. And I'm sure everybody's on this call, everybody understands that this is an important component. That's why you're here today to get some of this information. But we found it in our study, looking at the 5 VCA counties, that we heard from election officials, from community advocates, statewide advocates across the board, just what a critical role outreach is. And we know from previous research that we've done, survey research, a representative statewide survey across the state, just how the education process really is critical to folks, both understanding that there's a change period happening and feeling comfortable and having enough information to confidently and effectively navigate that new system and to feel confident in the voting process. And one quote that I'll give you to emphasize that, and it's particularly for the VCA, what we learned in 2018 was, if you break out that education component, it really is that voters first off need to know that there's this new model, right? That they, for instance, won't have their neighborhood polling place, but yet they have this vote center they can go for 11 days. But to know that there's just this change. And then second, that there's so much more, right? That there are many options and resources that are available to them under this new model. So they need to know that there's a change, and then also going to understand all of what that entails to be able to fully take advantage of it. But also at the same time, on the flip side, to make sure that we don't lose any voters along the way that might get confused or discouraged in the process. So one quote, and this is from an election official in our study, that I think sums this up pretty well. Quote, "You need to stay in contact with voters during the early voting period, or you may actually experience a reduction in voter participation in that election. Unless you constantly stay in touch with your constituents, unless you let them know," again, this is based on their experience around the VCA, "unless you constantly stay in touch with them, unless you let them know that there is a change in the election model from a traditional polling place to an all-mail or all-ballot election, all-mail ballot election, you make it an intensive effort to communicate. If you do not do that, you face the risk of the election not being as successful as it could be, and maybe even less engaging than a traditional polling place election." So again, that education process all the way through, with the voter. So let's move on here. So under that first bullet point, outreach collaboration with stakeholders. So we again heard both from election officials and community advocates just how important robust engagement and how critical it is. But particularly election officials really did emphasize that they have to work, that they need to work with community groups and other stakeholders during this process, that they were a key component of this. There's a recognition of it. What did vary, of course, is how they worked with community groups, their ability to work with community groups, but everyone understood that that was a critical component. In describing the benefits of working effectively with community groups and advocacy groups, here's a quote that I can give you. Quote, "Make sure they get everybody on board that they can." This is their advice to other counties that are newly adopting or thinking of adopting the VCA. "Whether it's advocacy groups or agencies out there that can help them, whether it is get them on board, whatever it is, get them on board because they'll help advertise, they'll help get the word out that this is how we're doing elections now, and that will make it successful." So next bullet point, coalition building and recruitment. And of course, for time, we're just kind of giving highlights here of the research, but again, you can access it on our website. Successful VCA implementation, of course, is a long process. And we heard that, a recognition of that, again, from both community groups and election officials. A long process through one election cycle, but it really is a long game in terms of that cumulative knowledge that hopefully is building in a jurisdiction, in a county, amongst voters and potential voters. Sustained collaboration is really key to that among community groups and election officials. That collaboration needs to be cultivated. It requires a lot of attention, a lot of time. It requires resources and funding to be successful. It isn't just let's get together and all agree to work, right, and move on, and then ultimately kind of work independently. It is something that needs to be cultivated and constantly kind of worked at. Of course, there's the work of FOS, which Future California Elections, which Astrid just covered, and she also talked about my next bullet point here on the slide about the coalitions that developed in Napa, Nevada, Sacramento counties, and of course, the one that developed into the VIOC in San Mateo County. What I'll just add here is that, again, we heard from in our study over and over again about the power of these coalitions. I mean, certainly we talk also in our work about the impact of the Future California Elections, but ultimately these groups that came together were the groups that were doing, right, the bulk or driving the outreach that was happening in their counties. And they were collaborating together and working together. And as much as they were successful, it was because of that work and that agreement early on, right, to collaborate and to share resources and information, and to continually do it through the election cycle. Targeted outreach materials. So coalition members, in collaboration with their county elections office, right, also worked specifically around kind of improving the existing outreach materials that counties were using. And they had really a really strong impact in doing this. So they created their own materials designed to reach voters, particularly focusing on historically underrepresented groups that needed in-language materials, and they helped also to improve what the counties had done as well. And just to give you an emphasis on that, another quote from an election official. Actually, this is a community advocate, excuse me. That's an area where the advocates came in really strong, and they created pamphlets and things that I thought were really well designed. And that's an area where counties don't have the time to design often well-crafted literature and stuff. And so the advocates played a really positive role there. And you all know, if you work with county election officials, even the most well-intended, and we have so many wonderful election officials in many, many counties, it's a resource game. It's an information situation, lack of information or lack of materials or funding, lack of know-how sometimes. And under the VCA, with the tremendous amount of work, particularly in the first election cycle, we saw that this relationship was absolutely critical. Under effective messaging, so election officials, we heard over and over again that their key goal around outreach was to encourage voters to cast their ballots early during the voting period. They wanted voters to get in early. And we know from other research that we've done around the VCA, and this is well known, I think, across the field now, if you just look at some of the voting data, that of course most everyone still in all those 5 counties voters waited until election day, or maybe the day before election day. There wasn't a lot of volume leading up to the day or so before, or a couple of days at least before election day. And election officials, this was on their mind even before the election period started. As we heard here, another quote, a lot of community groups in the VCC, Voters Choice California, did what they could. Some of them translated materials, some of them created their own graphics, and this kind of blends into the previous point. Informatics, memes, things like that, kind of spearheaded all of this stuff, and there were also certain foundations and groups that were doing this statewide for all counties just to educate themselves around that process. And I'll give another quote. Actually, let me talk about the challenges first. So in creating these messages, there also, of course, were a lot of challenges. How do we not only create messages that are effective, but a key part of being effective is also being simple. How do you get all of this information, right? All the components, all the very many, many positives around the VCA, all the changes that the VCA brings, doesn't make it really easy to create, simple messages. So consistency was really important in that. Consistency and simplification, messages that worked, but also part of working was making sure that they were consistent across the groups that were using them as much as possible and consistent on those many, many components. Just another quote to share, the vote early messaging is something that we're going to, and this is from an election official, going to work on. It wasn't that effective. We're trying to find different angles like, hey, make sure your ballot is included in the 8 p.m. election night results, or get it counted early. We also said stop some of those soliciting calls to return your ballot. We're trying to come up with different ways that might encourage people to actually vote early. So that's from an election official, recognizing that they're struggling with those messages around early voting. It wasn't as simple as they might have first hoped. So lessons learned, of course, can be applied to future election cycles, both by advocates and election officials. As one community advocate explained, there's a recalibration that's happening in the messaging that everybody's going to be using, right? I think for that next round, we're going to also recalibrate ourselves. We come at this voter engagement with so much information to voters that sometimes the reaction is to shut down. And for traditionally underrepresented voters that may not be accustomed to voting, it may all feel just too much to even deal with. And that's an important point, right, for historically underrepresented groups. If you think about just young people that by definition, first-time voters are not familiar with the process, and now they're also being told about changes when they may not have been aware of all that entailed when it came to voting prior to that. One message that, of course, Astrid just talked about that was widely considered to be very successful was the More Days, More Ways campaign, and how that came about is another story, an interesting story, but certainly how it was adopted and the consistent use across county outreach efforts was quite successful. Okay. Now, question number 2, significant resources and commitment required for election officials. I'm going to cover all these, of course, in detail. Demographic and geographic reach of outreach efforts, and then limited resources for election officials and community groups. All of this is under kind of addressing the question of what are the key challenges to conducting voter outreach under the VCA. These were the challenges that we heard in our research. So the first one, significant resources and commitment required for election officials. So we heard, notably so, from both, again, election officials and community advocates, community groups, that there was unmet outreach needs. There were unmet outreach needs in their counties. Not everybody, despite the tremendous efforts that were made and the very impactful work, particularly of the coalitions, the VCC coalitions that we've already mentioned, there still were voters that they weren't able to reach, right? And that was frustrating, of course, for many voters in many communities. And what often came up in this conversation was a recognition of the significant resources and the lack of resources that were available, both for election officials and for advocacy groups. So just talking about election officials at first, the second bullet point here, there was a recognition by election officials that to do this outreach, to be really effective, to do effective engagement, there needs to be a sincere and sustained commitment by election officials to engage voters, not just at the top by the registrar, but also by all that are going to be involved, right? So everybody involved in the implementation of the VCA, whether necessarily they're working with voters directly or not. And there was a recognition that for many election officials, this is a new idea, right? That they do outreach, but the outreach that is needed for the VCA is an entirely different level, and that not all counties have that experience or have the staffing or the know-how, or maybe even necessarily the comfort level. And recognizing that, we heard from, again, directly election officials involved, I think was an important component they thought in going forward in counties that were considering adopting, because kind of hitting that straight head on, if you will, in terms of how to address it. So to give a quote here, counties need to be open to a higher level of community engagement than they're used to, particularly around voter education. Again, that's from an election official. Oh, and my screen is not advancing. Can you advance me, Astrid? Maybe not. I guess
Yep.
you can.
Is that it?
There. Whatever the next one is, yeah. Okay, thank you. So limited resources for election offices and community advocates. So some election officials sought directly to leverage the time and expertise of community groups. So of course, as part of the law built into the Voters' Choice Act, election officials need to reach out to community groups, have their input on things like the election administration plan. But also there was a recognition by election officials that they were going to need the time and expertise, either because of their lack of their own resources or simply because of recognition of the sheer level of engagement that was going to be needed. Their capacity, the capacity of community groups, was going to be very necessary for them. So as one election official explained, the counties heavily relied on CBOs, community-based organizations, to get the word out. The counties don't have the amount of outreach staff that would be needed to do it on our own to go out and hit every group and every organization. But however, local community groups were generally understaffed. We heard this from many, many folks in our study, and under-resourced for that significant work that was needed, right, for effective outreach. Many community groups did the work anyway, even though recognizing that they still often couldn't get to everybody that they wanted to get to or needed to get to, but they did a lot of work that was stretched, right, and often even not funded, which of course is certainly not the ideal thing that we want to see for any group, but also it's not ideal under the Voters' Choice Act in terms of being able to have, there's an absolute necessity to be able to have the resources needed to get to everybody. Let me go ahead and move to the next slide, if it's going to let me. Could you advance me, Astrid? Thank you. And we did miss one slide, but I can just cover it verbally. So the other component under question number 2, those challenges around conducting outreach under the VCA, was demographic and geographic reach of outreach efforts. You may remember that bullet point. And again, here is just another, another set of recognitions, if you will, that not only did folks notably discuss the fact that outreach was not able to get to every community, right, and every geographic area, but there's also recognition that certain groups, right, whether it might be language access, it might be voters from historically underrepresented groups, that there were geographies and demographic groups that, oh, we're advancing really fast, so I'm not sure what's happening on the screen. I'm not touching the screen. Anyway, and just a recognition that needs to be, as we go forward, a component that's actively discussed and recognized in future outreach plans at the county level. That traditionally underrepresented voters need more support. There also was recognition, by the way, we talk about this briefly in our report, that, oh, there you go, there's the quote. Traditionally underrepresented voters often need more support in getting that information, and the mechanisms for that outreach varied. I think that the most effective was the knock on the door and the personal conversations. That is not anything innovative, but from the conversations I had with our network, that's what they still found to be the most effective in making sure that voters have the information that they needed, especially about the VCA, right, and all those options that we've talked about. So for those of you that do on the ground work, right, in your communities, you know that, and we know this from a research perspective, that the peer-to-peer, the person-to-person, particularly peer-to-peer, contact is the most effective in just get out the vote. And we heard here in the study that just in educating around the VCA, it also was ultimately the most effective. If you want to go ahead and advance me to the first applying the findings study, that slide, that would be great. One more, there we go, thanks. Okay, so let's just sum up the key points here around kind of the conclusion, if you will. So counties adopting the VCA for the first time should not underestimate the degree of voter outreach and engagement that will be needed for successful implementation, right? We're talking about successful implementation. Outreach was and remains a significant challenge for the 5 counties that adopted the VCA. And to meet this need, election officials and community groups suggested the following steps. Next slide, please. I think I'm just trying to make Astrid, be my Vanna or something. I'm so sorry. Connect with community groups early, long before the voting process begins. Now, of course, we're talking to you, 2 weeks before ballots are going to go out. And with 11-day vote centers, people can vote even earlier now, right? In an early March 3rd primary. So, so for those of you that haven't been part of a coalition, so this is, we're emphasizing the importance here, but certainly much work can be done and should be done, even if you don't have a coalition that you're attached to yet in your county. Hopefully you will be able to do that. Broaden engagement by significantly increasing the number and types of organizations involved. So who are the groups that are in your coalition that are at the table, that are sharing and working together and planning and strategizing around those VCA outreach efforts? Are you representing, demographically and geographically, all the communities and voter groups in your county? Next, consider conducting VCA outreach efforts at already existing community events. And I think Astrid might have already covered this, but we heard over and over again, voters don't necessarily want to come out for a talk about a new voting model. But if you got them there for something else, then you partner with that organization. Combining those groups combining those efforts into one meeting can be a lot more effective. Next slide. Okay. Oh, maybe we'll go back one, I think. Did we skip one? No, go back one, please. Nope, we're going forward. Sorry, everybody, we're almost there. Yeah. Well, the thing I think that we were going to talk next about was just the voter's experience while we're getting to that slide, which is near the end of the PowerPoint. So yeah, there you go. So we want to just emphasize here, I want to emphasize here before I close out my talk, ultimately, we're not just talking about outreach, right? Getting voters out to the polls and to understand and navigate and get them there one time, what they experience. So let's say they get the information, they get there, and they're actually able to successfully vote if they're voting in person, or they're dropping off their vote, or they're mailing it successfully, whatever their method is that they choose. You want that experience to be positive. And we heard quite significantly in our study from, again, both election officials and community groups and advocates, that there are really three components to that positive experience that hopefully will mean voters will come back. So certainly the robust voter outreach efforts that we talked about, that they understand what that new experience is going to be like. They're not confused. They feel comfortable and confident in going to that vote center if they're going to a vote center. But also that the operational logistics of the vote center is efficient, is working well. They can get through. They know when they get there where they're supposed to go. They're not confused. The systems are working. The lookups are working, lookup tools are working, and that also certainly where there may be lines, we avoid lines at wherever possible. And we have some talk about the line experience in some of our other research under this study. So basically to help increase voters' awareness and ensure successful use of vote center services that are available to them, right? All of this is part of that. And collaborating with community groups, election officials collaborating with community groups was absolutely vital for communicating with voters about all of these changes. Next slide, please. I think, yeah. So the importance of the voter experience under the VCA. So we know that, as we've already talked about today, there are so many positive components to the VCA. The VCA brings together a number of election reforms under one act and does bring more choices and more services to voters and a longer voting period to voters. But it also, and we heard this in our study as well, that it has the potential to inconvenience some voters, such as with lines or lack of understanding of how the new system works. Confusion about on election day or when they plan to vote, where to go, for instance. A commitment by election officials and communities to invest in a realistic and sufficient allocation of resources for both that administrative component, but also for the collaborative outreach component is absolutely critical. essentially for voters to walk away feeling positive, and that potentially impacting the future use of the voting process and for voters going forward in that county. And I think my next slide is a thank you slide. Yes, okay, all done. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mindy, and apologies for the technological issues there, but thank you for working with us and sharing all of that great content.
Thank you.
We did have one question that came in, and if folks have questions, you can type it into the chat window or the Q&A feature. And the question is, how, to the points that you're making about the effectiveness of messaging, how was the effectiveness determined, and did you guys find what worked and what didn't work with messaging to voters in your research?
Oh, great question. So for us, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. For us, this was the perception of interviewees. So for us to be able, from a research standpoint, to be able to say something was effective or not effective directly with a voter, first of all, there's lots of ways, right, from a research standpoint to measure that. Is it that it meant that the person was more likely to vote, for instance, or more likely to navigate a certain component of the VCA? And that requires other types of research, right? Incredibly extensive research for us to be able to do that. So in this study, it was about the perceptions of the folks that we spoke with, right? All those interviewees and focus groups, what they considered to be the most successful from their experiences on the ground, right? In working with voters, if that hopefully makes sense to people. We are not saying ourselves independently that we've conducted a study, you know, and been able to connect it directly, causally, a causal study, because we're just not able to do that. We are, as a research center, engaging now going forward in some other research that is testing, for instance, some experimental research, survey research that's testing different messaging around the VCA, and we're pretty excited about that. And that will be able to allow us to make a causal connection. And a lot of that work is informed by this study here that I just presented today, our 5-county VCA study. So the messaging that seemed to work, that counties and communities felt were the most effective in working with you know, on the ground, then we can also kind of hopefully through our research put some causal analysis to it and potentially fine tune that or that sort of thing. So hopefully that's addressing that question.
Great, thanks. And if folks have other questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat feature or the Q&A function. We're going to continue with the presentation. Let's see if I can advance. Katie, will you advance one slide?
Yeah, interesting. It says you have control.
Okay, here we go. And so we're going to go into Voters' Choice Act in 2020 and how organizations can engage in VCA implementation. So where are we in the implementation timeline? And here I started with the beginning of the year. There was an entire process that happened kind of late summer, fall, and is finalizing now, which is the development of the election administration plans. That's the EAP. Every county has to develop a plan to explain how they will transition to the new voting model. And there was community workshops and public engagement and public comment that was taken. And so many of the counties have either adopted a final plan or in the last weeks of adopting that final plan. And so those are on your county websites if you wanted to read through the whole plan. In the winter, many counties will be hosting voter education workshops as required by the VCA to inform the public. Specifically, these workshops are with limited English proficient voters and voters with disabilities. And that was a model that we learned in the last cycle, is the importance of partnering with your county to be a venue for those workshops to make sure that the voters that need the information are getting it. January 23rd, ballot materials are in the mail. And February 3rd is the first day of the vote by mail period. So drop boxes will be open throughout the county, and that's at that 28 days before Election Day mark. February 17th is the close of registration to receive materials by mail. So I just want to make a point here that we don't really have a voter registration deadline. California has same-day voter registration. You can register right up through Election Day. What the February 17th deadline is more of an administrative deadline to ensure that you can get your election materials by mail. And that's a really important point, especially for the primary for nonpartisan voters that may have to request a specific ballot. And then February 22nd, the 10-day vote centers open, and I took this phrase, it is not my phrase, from Madera County. They came up with the phrase, every day is election day, February 22nd through March 3rd. And I just thought that is a really great way to start thinking about this new voting model. As Mindy's research showed, many folks wait right up until the last day to vote because we are accustomed to only having one day to vote. But every day is election day. Your vote will count regardless of when it is cast, so long as it is cast before the close of election day, which is March 3rd. So again, 10-day vote centers open on the February 22nd, and then every vote center is open the weekend before election, right through election day. Great. And one thing I'll mention actually for the last slide, we've developed a social media toolkit for the March primary that highlights each of those milestones for social media posts. If you were interested in doing that, it's on our website at voterschoice.org. So what are the opportunities to engage in VC implementation in your community? Connect with your local coalition. This work is, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of coordination. It's important to get the messages right by identifying a coalition in your region, or maybe building your own for your community if you don't have one. You help identify maybe priority areas that you know will need the additional outreach for communities that may not be connected in a traditional way to an election office. Also encourage you to work with your election office to leverage the resources and coordinating messages. You know, the materials that election offices send out reach every voter in the county. And so working with them on the messaging, we saw that in 2018, as Mindy shared, counties value that input of developing plain language materials to reach voters. And so if your county has a committee where you could advise on plain language or on accessibility, join those committees locally. Develop common messaging to reduce voter confusion. There can be many ways to explain what this transition to a new voting model is. And so by coordinating messages, you're going to make sure that the voters that you're reaching, that another partner may be reaching, are all hearing that same message, so that they know that when they hear about the Voters' Choice Act, everyone is talking about the same thing. And that's especially true when doing outreach in other languages. Partner with your election office. As I mentioned previously, the Voters' Choice Act requires that the county have a language accessibility advisory committee and a voting accessibility advisory committee. So join those and be part of the input and advice that goes into making sure that this voting model serves your community. And then also counties have established other committees. So they're calling the outreach committees, for example, or education committees. And so connect with your county, see what's available, and join those groups as well. And then a final way that you can support VC implementation is recruiting vote center workers. County election officials will need to recruit 10-day employees and 10 days plus with the training, and then also the weekend before election day, they have to staff all of those vote centers. And so helping them recruit great folks that can support in the vote centers directly to make sure that voters have the best service possible. One thing that's really unique about the Voters' Choice Act is that it is a dynamic model and it requires input and recalibration. So while the counties have adopted final election administration plans to go into the election 2020 season, they will have to revise those plans periodically in the coming years. So after the first election under the VCA, the counties will have to revise it after 2 years and then subsequently every 4 years. And so stay engaged, continue to collect information about how your community is experiencing the new voting model, and provide your county with that feedback about how to best serve your community. You are the expert of your community, and you can provide that input to your county election office. You don't have to wait till the next cycle, maybe set up a meeting with them or with staff following this election or after the primary to make sure that those trouble spots are identified. Again, this is new for many, many election offices, for many communities, and so we're all learning together, and sharing that information will be really valuable to ensuring that all voters are served by this new voting model. So in 2020, our network is going to continue. So we are continuing the Voters' Choice California project. We are currently monitoring statewide implementation. Our steering committee is engaged and supporting local networks statewide. So if you are not connected to a local network, shoot us an email and we'll help you get connected or identify a contact at your election office. FOS staff specifically, we are leading coalitions for Los Angeles and Orange County. And so if you want to be a part of those, please go ahead and email us with your interest in that, and happy to invite you to those conversations. And then we are continuing to support the field through plain language materials. You can copy and paste and use these resources. As I mentioned, the social media toolkit for the March primary is up. We have a VCA 101 PowerPoint. It helps you kind of take that presentation and introduce the Voters' Choice Act to your community. We have fact sheets and also links to all 15 county election offices. So if you want to find what the EAP is, if you want to know what's happening in your county, go on our website, voterschoice.org, and you can find access to those county election offices. And then finally, we have been putting out reports as we have been learning about this process. And so we have a report on building a local VCA coalition and also strategies for voter education and outreach. And we've done those after each election, so we'll continue to update them. So those are just some ways that we're going to continue this work, and we hope that you will partner with us. And so some next steps as we come to the conclusion of this presentation is join a local network. We keep on emphasizing that, but the Voters' Choice Act was really created thinking about the voters. And so the voters are invited to be part of defining their election administration process. Connect with us. You can sign up with our distribution list at voterschoice.org. Give us feedback. Let us know what you thought about this presentation. What resources does your community need to engage? We always want to identify ways that we can continue supporting you. So with that, we are at the end of our presentation. I'm going to put a quick poll at the end to give us feedback, some live feedback on this. And we will take some remaining questions that have come in here through the chat feature. So let me quickly read through these. There's a question here about if Los Angeles County's vote center sites have been designated and where is this list? So currently LA County is still vetting their vote center sites. And to our knowledge, they should be up next week. That is what we've been told, and it will be put up on their website. And if you are on our list, we will e-blast those links to you. So sign up for our Voters' Choice Los Angeles list specifically, and feel free to email me to get you connected with that. Other questions coming in, feel free to send them via chat. All right. Question here, and Mindy, maybe you can address this one from your research. The question is, what efforts were made by counties to address youth Latino voters and low propensity voters?
Sure. I think the short answer is all counties said that they were doing that work. Again, just a recognition, as I stated earlier in the presentation, that also we heard from not only on the community group side, but from almost all of the counties that they felt like they recognized that they hadn't reached everyone. And particularly were concerned that they were not only geographic areas, but there were demographic areas, communities that were underrepresented, that they still needed to do more outreach to. So there were efforts to be made. That's also part of the requirement around the election administration plan and the VCA itself to make sure that communities of color, particularly underrepresented communities, period, are part of that robust outreach effort. Part of the citing process. There's 14 criteria around the citing process under the Voters' Choice Act, and recognizing, acknowledging in the citing process the questions around accessibility for underrepresented groups. How successful they were, I think we're still learning as we go forward. How to make sure that everyone receives that outreach. I'll put it that way.
Great, thank you, Mindy. And I'll add that I think many of the counties are currently in that process, also hosting those workshops right now for this cycle of VCA implementation as required by the VCA. As Mindy mentioned, they have to host workshops with each of the required language communities, each of the covered languages for their county, as well as workshops with voters with disabilities. And so if you're interested in that, get connected with your local LAC and reach out to your election official on that.
And Astrid, I'll just mention one other thing. And when I was answering counties, I was assuming that they meant the election officials, but on both ends, election officials and community groups. And again, everybody recognized the importance of the burden not just being on the election offices, but it's a critical component is that collaboration and also funding. So as you all work in your communities, we know that the current funding landscape, which we didn't get to talk about earlier, but is very sparse. And so as much as you can work with your existing coalitions, or if you're building coalitions in your communities or building that network, as you can reach out either for the primary or maybe for the general, but reach out for funding is absolutely critical, because right now currently, that landscape is again sparse and less than what we saw in 2018, and we have more counties now that are adopting. So just a recognition of the reality of resources that are needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Thank you.
And when I say funding, I should clarify, I'm talking about on the nonprofit landscape. So
yes. So if you're a funder, fund local nonprofits,
yes.
and we appreciate that support. A question here before we wrap this up is: isn't California moving to all vote by mail? Then why are counties buying new voting machines?
You want me to take that, or were
yes.
you gonna...
Go ahead.
Okay, well, the Voters' Choice Act isn't an all vote by mail election, right? It's more days, more ways. It gives options to voters. And so, so and voting machines are, I think, a critical part of the planning around the VCA going forward for counties, right? If they're adopting the VCA, then for instance, the number of machines that they have, and certainly the technical components that are needed around the VCA, they have to be considering that. But we're not an all vote by mail election by any means, and there's still the rest of the non-15 counties in California that are not adopting. We have really high vote by mail use rates in California, but we're not an all mail ballot state.
Great. And with that, we come to the end of our presentation. So I wanted to say thank you so much, Mindy, for joining us, for sharing your research, for doing your research, and for your continued partnership in this work.
Well, right back at you. Thank you very much for your ongoing support and partnership, Astrid. So we appreciate your leadership in the field.
Thank you. Thank you. And for everyone, thank you for joining us for this webinar. Send us your feedback, what other materials or information do you want to see. We want to continue hosting this through this election cycle. So again, email us, contact us on Twitter, and also join our social media campaign Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Use the hashtag More Days, More Ways, and include your county name to spread the word about this new voting model coming to 50% of California's electorate. So thanks so much, everyone.